today I want to consider the present situation in Israel, what they are facing, and what is behind all the political hype that we have been hearing. Behind all that are two religious ideologies that are at the center of the world's problems. And unless and until they recognize that Yahweh has chosen people who are Israel, and their collective future will be in the hands of Yeshua himself, so it is inevitable that there will be destruction of the nations that stand against Israel. It often comes as a surprise to many people that the world's problems of today are actually spoken about in Torah, the prophets, and also the words of Yeshua in his earthly ministry. So having laid the background of what I'm about to say, I want to dig more deeply into the words behind Yeshua's statement in Romans 15, and consider just how it applies to us today. I want to focus particularly on the two books, Daniel and Revelation, where we see how many of the words in both books are totally relevant to the circumstances of the world today. Now, back in 2017, I gave midweek lectures in this very room on the book of Daniel, which I entitled God's GPS for the 21st Century. I brought forth my understanding of how the book of Daniel is to the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, what Revelation is to the Brit Hadashah, or New Testament. And together, they open us to many of the hidden reasons behind the actions of the various nations and people groups in this present era. Within the book of Daniel, we see that there are, in fact, two distinctly different people called Daniel. The first Daniel was the prophet who spoke extensively about the four empires that would impact on Israel over many centuries. In fact, his predictions pointed all the way forward to the Six-Day War of 1967 and to the end of the 6,000 years of human development that occurred in 2017. I'll explain those details at some future time. That first Daniel was the one who Nebuchadnezzar took into exile in Babylon at the time of the destruction of the first temple. He was about 15 years old when he went into exile. And the last mention of him is in Daniel chapter 10, verse 1, which was in the third year of Koresh, Cyrus, king of Persia. Now the second Daniel was a Cohen, who was a contemporary of Ezra, and appears to have journeyed back to Jerusalem along with Ezra and other Kohanim and Leviim when the second temple building had been completed. The words from the two Daniels are profoundly important when we consider the situation in the modern state of Israel and how it finds itself in the present state. Their words here help us to understand the reason why the nations are behaving the way they are towards Israel, and to help us understand how the present situation will be brought to its end. However, before we can apply the words of Daniel and Revelation in relation to that present situation, we need to step aside from the political rhetoric that is floating around and look at the whole situation from a spiritual or scriptural perspective. In 1948, the modern state of Israel was formed under the hand of Yahweh, which enabled a large number of the people of Yehuda, the Jews from most of war-torn Europe, were enabled to return to Eretz Israel and establish the modern state. But from the world's perspective, their reason for the state of Israel being formed was by resolution of the United Nations, so that Britain could be released from its mandate. From the world's perspective, the establishment of the state was in many ways a collective cleansing of the conscience of the Christian world, to free themselves from any blame for the atrocities that had occurred in the Shoah, or the Holocaust. However, the establishment of the State of Israel also sparked the fires of resentment among the surrounding Arab nations. Yet, it was not until 19 years later, in June 1967, that the hatred harboured by the Arabs boiled over, which of course was manifest by the formation of the Palestinian Authority in the heartland of Israel. But from a scriptural perspective, that 6-day war was another intervention by Yahweh in the fulfillment of the words spoken by Yeshua himself in Luke 21, verse 24, where he was saying, "Some will fall by the sword, and others will be carried into the countries of the Goyim, and Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Goyim until the age of the Goyim has run its course." Those were the words of Yeshua spoken when he was actually informing his Talmudim about the pending destruction of the Second Temple, and how the people of Yehuda would either be killed or taken into exile. He was saying that Jerusalem would remain under external domination until the age of the Goyim ended. So let's unpack those words and see what it means in the first century terminology. The word Goyim related primarily to the Hellenistic world of the Roman Empire. That people group has now, of course, been loosely called the Gentiles. But when Yeshua was speaking, he was actually meaning not just any nation other than Israel, but rather he was speaking about a specific group of nations that later became known, of course, as the nations of Christendom, who adopted the Eusebian ideology, or in other words, the modern version of the earlier Hellenistic ideology of Greece. He spoke about the pending situation by saying following the Jewish uprising against the Roman rulership, which began in 66-67 CE, there was going to be a 3-year period before the temple would be destroyed. And during that 3-year period, Yeshua's faithful Talmudim, who heeded the words Yeshua had earlier spoken, escaped from Jerusalem before it was actually put under final siege and was destroyed in 70 CE by Titus. But all who remained in the city were either killed or taken away as slaves. Those taken from Jerusalem were exiled throughout the Roman diaspora, which later, of course, became part of Christian Europe. However, at varying stages throughout the age of the Goyim, Jerusalem remained largely in a trampled condition, just as Yeshua said it would be. And it was occupied alternately by Christians and Muslim empires. So until 1967, the nation did little more than remain as a trampled city, and few had any regard for it, and particularly the Temple Mount. Even though the Muslims stamped their mark on that same Temple Mount by building the Dome of the Rock, it still remained as a backwater. However, following the 6-day war, the city and the Temple Mount once again became the center of the world's attention, and particularly the two religious ideologies, Christianity and Islam, with both claiming ownership of the Temple Mount. So that leads us back to the book of Daniel, where Daniel the prophet was told in a vision the sovereignty of Jerusalem would finally be returned to the people of Israel. As we read in Daniel chapter 8, in his vision, the angel Gabriel shows Daniel the battle between two animals. One is called the two-horned ram, and the other the shaggy male goat. In that same vision, Gabriel explains that the ram represents Medo-Persia, and the shaggy goat typifies Alexander the Great of Greece. In verse 13 and 14, Daniel said, I heard a Holy One speaking, and another one said to the speaker, how long will these events of the vision last? The first said to me, 2,000 evenings and mornings. After that, the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. Then, in verse 26, Daniel was given a clue about the period to be covered by the vision Gabriel had given. The vision of the evenings and mornings, as has been told, is true. But you are to keep the vision secret, because it is about the days way into the distant future. As the vision was at the end of a distant period, it seems reasonable to assume that Gabriel was speaking in terms of years. So if we take the starting point as occurring at the time of Alexander the Great, when he conquered Medo-Persia in 332 BCE, and count forward 2,300 years, we come to 1967. Was that a coincidence, or was it the outworking of Yahweh's chronology? Another important feature of the vision is that Alexander the Great was the one who introduced Hellenism to Yehuda. That, as we know, became the downfall of Israel's priesthood, who sold themselves into the Hellenistic culture, which, of course, led to the desecration of the Second Temple by Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BCE. That is why we acknowledge the Maccabean conquest and the restoration of the temple and celebrate it as Hanukkah. The other nation seen in Daniel's vision, of course, is Medo-Persia, which was recently, in 1979, was overpowered by the Islamic regime of Iran. And that brings us to the second Daniel, whom we read about in chapter 9, who was given the vision by the same Gabriel. But it was at a much later stage, as we're told in verse 1 of chapter 9. In the first year of Darius, who was Darius II, who was the son of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes I, who was a Mede by birth, was made king over the kingdom of Kasdim. The first year of Darius was 423 BCE, or in other words, 130 years after the vision of the 2,300 evenings and mornings had been given. So you can see that Daniel who received the first vision of the 2,300 evenings and mornings could not be the same one as was receiving this vision in the first year of Darius, because he would have been well over 200 years old at that stage. So Daniel, the Cohen, we see in chapter 9, was told in verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and for the holy city, putting an end to the transgressions and making an end to sin, for forgiving iniquity and for bringing in everlasting justice, for setting the seal on vision and prophet and anointing the especially holy place. The count in the vision begins, as he said in 9 verse 1, Darius' first year, which was 423 BCE. So by adding 70 times 7, or 490 years, to that date, we come to 67 CE, which was the same year that the Jewish revolt began. So again we can see there is no coincidence, but rather it is the hand of Yahweh who brought about the timing. Then if we count forward from 67 CE, a total of 1900 years, we come to 1967. Now it's interesting. 1900 years equals 38 Yovels, which reflects the length of time the first generation of Israel spent wandering in the wilderness. Again, the reason that first generation died out in the wilderness was because they had constantly held Yahweh in contempt. In the same way, that first century Yehudah had no excuse for their rejection of Yeshua. So they, in turn, spent 38 Yovels in the Hellenistic wilderness. That first century generation who heard the words of Yeshua himself, like their forefathers, had no excuse for rejecting Yeshua, because the two other prophets besides Daniel had also warned about the pending destruction of the temple. The first one, as we read, is in Ezeki'el, who was told to lie on his right side for 40 days to bear the guilt of the house of Yehudah, just as he had lain on his left side for 390 days for Israel. So, as it says, considering each day as a year, we see that between the splitting of the nation at the end of the reign of Shlomo or Solomon until the destruction of the first temple was 390 years. Likewise, the time that Ezekiel lay on his right side represented 40 years of Yehudah. And the time period between the death of Yeshua in 30 CE and the destruction of the second temple in 70 was 40 years. Again, Yahweh adopts the same principle with Jonah, who was told to warn Nineveh that their city would be, if they did not repent, the city would be destroyed in 40 days' time. Now the first part of that sign was applied to the death and resurrection of Yeshua, where, like Yonah, Yeshua lay dead for 3 days and 3 nights before he was resurrected. Therefore, the authorities should have realized the significance of that sign of Yonah following the resurrection of Yeshua. They should have also reasoned the significance of that time frame Yonah had given to the Nineveh. If they had recognized the 40 days for Nineveh could be translated into years, they would have realized that it was 40 years before their temple would be destroyed. They would have had 40 years in which to repent, but they did not. So we see from the words of just 3 prophets, Daniel, Ezekiel, and Yonah, that the events that are occurring in this age now were spoken about well in advance and confirmed by the words of Yeshua himself. Yet, like the authorities in the time of Yeshua, those signs were ignored. So returning again to Daniel the prophet, we see in his final vision in chapter 12 that he was given a dual time frame. I mean by that, it appears that it had 2 separate and distinct fulfillments. The first was a literal time frame of 1290 days, followed directly by 1335 days, which, when you combine those 2 numbers, was from the first part of the fulfillment was the uprising of the Zealots in Caesarea in 66 CE. Counting forward 1290 days brings us to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Then following on from there with the 1335 days, it saw the end of the war with the Romans storming Masada in 74 CE. And they found that the Zealots had joined in a murder-suicide pact. That brought an end to the whole uprising. The second fulfillment of that same time frame, if considered as years, begins with the destruction of the first temple. And we find a very interesting outcome. the 1290 years, counting from 607, the time of the first temple's destruction, we arrive at 682 CE, which saw the building of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. Then if we add another 1335 years, we arrive at 2017, which by my calculation was the end of the 6,000 years of human development. Again, it is not a coincidence, but rather the fingerprint of Yahweh upon the march of time. And having seen how many prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures relate to the modern times and events, we can take courage from those words of Shaul in Romans 15 verse 4. Everything that was written in the past was to teach us, so that with the encouragement from the Tanakh, we might patiently hold on to our hope. Next, we need to turn to the book of Revelation. We also find many references to events that are occurring in this present era, but particularly in chapter 17, where Yochanan, or John, is given a list of 7 empires that have impacted directly upon the life of Israel. Now I must say at this point that what I'm going to share is my understanding of the situation, and I'm still getting a clearer picture as time and events unfold. So please bear with me, because I think it is important to consider the words of chapter 17 in relationship to what is happening in the world today. I'll let you be the judge of whether what I'm saying is valid or not. Starting in verses 9 through 14, Yochanan records all that he saw in this particular vision by saying, 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman is sitting. They are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is now living, the other is yet to come. And when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast is an 8th king. It comes from the 7, but it is going on its way to destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet begun to rule, but they receive power as kings for 1 hour along with the beast. They have one mind. They hand over their power and authority to the beast. They go to war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will defeat them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are called, chosen and faithful will overcome along with him. Now it is important and necessary to unpack all that Yochanan is trying to say in those verses. But we do not have time today to drill down to all those details. So I want to move on and suggest how I believe it relates to the current situation facing the state of Israel at the moment. As we appear to be living in the age of the 8th king, that is the beast, it follows that the 10 kings will sometime in the near future give their authority to that beast and come against the Lamb and those with him. I think we would all agree that the Lamb, of course, is another name for Yeshua, who appears to be standing in this vision on the Temple Mount along with his chosen ones, which is even spoken about in Revelation chapter 14 verse 1, where Yochanan said, I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000. But for that to occur, those ones must first be lifted up to be with Yeshua. They, and possibly many others, will have a part in the first resurrection before Yeshua returns as Ben David, the conquering king. That first resurrection must take place, as Shaul says in 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 and 17. The Lord himself will come down from heaven with a rousing cry, with a call from one of the ruling angels, and with God's shofar. Those who died united with Messiah will first rise. Then we who are left still alive will be caught up with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we will always be with the Lord. Then, having been removed from the world's scene, Yeshua will sometime later return with that 144,000 to be confronted on the Temple Mount by those 10 kings. That will, I believe, start the destruction that will be meted out upon all the nations that are knowingly standing against Israel. All those nations who have operated under the umbrella of the two religious ideologies, Christendom and Islam, will pay a very high price for their collective actions against the people of Israel. So while all this is occurring around us, we do well to constantly reflect on those words of Shaul in Romans 15, and remember that it is only through the words of Torah and the prophets that we will understand the reality of what is actually happening at present as we wait for our deliverance to draw near. Shabbat Shalom.